Everyone. It's great to have you here and have you in this virtual parish mission. And just a couple ground rules just before we get started. Just to note that our talk is being recorded. So we have to behave and be on our best behavior because this will be forever in cyberspace. In fact, Sister Diane we were talking about with this George, and we were talking about it's actually also going to Mars. The rover will be watching this week as well. So it's good to have you here. I want to thank our joint spiritual formation commission between the two parishes of St. Paschal Baylon and the Church of St. Clair. Barb Curran and Rosalie Lewis are our co-chairs, and George Pico, our host here with me, is our catechetical leader. And they're the wonderful trinity who help us with all these spiritual events that we do between the parishes, with retreats and missions and days of reflection. And tonight we're very fortunate to have live here on our Zoom broadcast, Sister Diane Bergant. She's an Ignatian sister, which is a community of sisters based in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, on the other side of the lake where I had my novitiate in Menasha, Wisconsin. And she has taught and been a part of the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, Illinois for, gosh, a very long time. She's been an editor at Bible Today and many writings and publications and books. And I was blessed to have her, and she was blessed to have me as a student back in the late 80s at CTU, Catholic Theological Union. Not to take any more of her time, I want to welcome and present to you Sister Diane Bergant.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here this evening, and I'm very happy to share with you some reflections on what I want to call the biblical foundations of some of the comments made by the Holy Father in his document, Laudato Si. I'm going to start just with a couple of reflective ideas. Every single one of us is fascinated by the natural world. Every single one of us. It's almost like we are wired to be fascinated by the workings of the natural world. We sit and we watch a sunrise and a sunset. We also like to sit in a boat, doing nothing, but just in the boat, maybe in the sailboat, or sitting out in the springtime and allowing the wind just to brush our faces, or the crispness of winter, the beauty of snow, the intoxication of rain. We are fascinated by this. Not just children, we are fascinated by this. Look at the content of cards. How many cards have something to do with the beauty of nature? What is it about nature that so fascinates us? And I don't have the answer to that. There are all kinds of answers. One could say we're fascinated by it, because we are part of it, which is true. But other people may have another answer. But I invite you to think about how fascinated you are by elements of the natural world. By elements of the natural world. Also, we are totally dependent on elements of the natural world. As we look at some of the things these evenings now, some of the themes that we find in the Holy Father's document, we reflect for just a moment that there is a relationship between the way we understand the natural world, of which we are a part. It's not the natural world and us, as if we are outside of it, but how we understand the natural world and God, the relationship between the natural world and God. And we always interpret our understanding of religion or theology through the lens of our received and understood cosmology. Now, what do I mean by that? There's probably every single one of us has sometime been to a basketball game when somebody makes a magnificent three-pointer, and frequently what do? They look up. Now, we all know what that means. The presumption is that they're looking up, thanking God, as if God is either someplace in the stands or in the rafters. But of course, God is in heaven, and heaven is up there. In the ancient world, and that's the world out of which the Bible came, both testaments, they had different understandings of the structure of the cosmos. Frequently, it was some form of different tiered, let's say 3-tiered, and then you can expand that as much as you want, but 3-tiered. In other words, human beings live on earth, which is flat. God is in the heaven, and the dead are underneath the earth. That's a 3-tiered. And you can expand how many tiers there are in heaven, how many tiers there are in hell, all right? But 3-tiered. Now, if that's your cosmology, then the way you understand either the ascension or the assumption makes sense, because the ascension said he ascended into heaven. Well, if in that cosmology, that makes sense, or that she was assumed into heaven. But you and I know we don't live in that kind of a cosmos. We know that we live on a sphere. Now, if you live on the sphere, which way is up? And how far is up? And I'm sure we've all been in airplanes above the clouds, and there's nothing up there, but maybe more clouds or open space. There's no throne where God sits in the clouds. In getting back to the idea of the ascension or the assumption, thinking that they go up to heaven, if you take new cosmology, your understanding of an evolving universe, or just, basic cosmology, if Jesus really ascended, went up, unless he has hit something in space, he is still on a trajectory shooting out into space. And we know scientifically, the further you get from the center of the universe, the less magnetic pull there is, which means the faster he's going. Now think of Jesus, who has ascended into heaven, still shooting out into the universe, going faster and faster and faster. Faster maybe than the speed of light, or maybe approaching it with Mary right behind him, a little behind him, because she died later on. Now that's ridiculous, which means that theology about the ascension and the assumption, it does not mean we dump it. It means we describe the theology in a different way. Even Paul does not talk about Jesus ascending into heaven. The image that he uses is he is enthroned, he is exalted at the right hand of the Father, which is a different metaphor because God has no hands. But we know that means he is exalted in the place of honor because the right hand is the place of honor. Now, I give those two examples to underscore the fact that our theology is frequently expressed in a cosmology that is not ours. All right, if we would put this aside for just a moment. Back in 1967, a man by the name of Lynn White, a PhD out at Stanford, I think he was philosophy of science, I'm not sure, or it could have been philosophy of history, but I know he was out in Stanford in 67. He wrote an article. Now, I might be paraphrasing the title. I don't have it exactly. I'm sorry. The historical roots of our ecologic disaster. Okay, the historic roots of our ecologic disaster. And in that article, he places the blame for all of the ecological devastation we experience now. And that is polluted air, polluted water, toxic land, climate control, whatever cosmic or ecological problems you have recognized. He places the blame for that at the doorstep of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which means the Bible. And he does that because he claims that there is in the first creation narrative in Genesis 1, when God created the man in Genesis 1 and said to the man, increase and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion. That means have power over it. And because of that, human beings have not only used that power, but have abused it. Right? And I want to say that that is a misinterpretation of that biblical text. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on this evening. But he also says in this article that if we want to understand correctly some kind of religious understanding of our relationship or participation in the natural world, a relationship with God and the natural world, we've got to do one of two things. We have to either get a new religion or we have to reinterpret the old one. Now, I'm not in favor of getting a new religion, but to reinterpret the old one is what theologians have always done. Now, when he claims, still with Lynn White, when he claims that the devastation in the natural world is to be laid at the foot, at the doorstep, or at the feet of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it is for this reason, one of the reasons he gives. In very traditional societies, there aren't many left in the world today. There are a couple, but there aren't many. And even more progressive societies still carry some of their traditional understanding. They held an understanding referred to as animism. Animism means they recognize the mysteriousness. I don't want to call it miraculous character, but the mysteriousness in the natural world. I mean, just the idea of growth in nature. You plant a seed and look what you get. How does that work? And it knows how to do it without us telling it how to do it. Nor does he read the directions from a book. The seed knows what to do. The trees know, or the heliotropic plants, heliotropic meaning they turn to the sun, the helios. So they know how to do that. They don't have to be taught that. There's something instinctual there. Now, they recognize that mysteriousness, particularly in living things. Life is mysterious. A little aside, years ago, when I was a young nun, I taught in 7th and 8th grade for a couple of years. And after I left one of the missions, when I went to graduate school, I still kept my doctor. And I had to have some surgery one time. So I went up and I had the surgery where I had taught in that city. And I recuperated in the convent where I used to live. And I remember this one time. It was morning recess. And it was the little kids, the primary school kids, they were running past my window. I was in the community room, which was all windows. The kids were running past my window, going to the playground. And it was the strangest experience because it wasn't anything new that I was seeing, but I was seeing it in another way. All right. I was fascinated by the force of energy of these little kids, just fascinated by it. And what it affected me in that I realized, and I was almost brought to tears. I realized my body was healing itself. Now that might sound very strange, but if you have a comparable experience, it's not strange. I had a realization my body was healing itself. Our bodies heal itself. Medicine gives us a help, but our bodies do the healing. And our bodies knit us back together. It's magnificent. The birth of a new child is not the only magnificent thing that the human body can do, as magnificent as that is. it can knit itself back together. How does it know how to do that? So there is that mystery in life, in living things. Right? Now, to recognize that mystery is wonderful. In some ways, I think our generation has lost it. But to recognize that mystery, that mysterious something or other is magnificent. But traditional people thought that power was divine. So they not only looked at the tree and was fascinated by it, but they looked at the tree and worshiped it because of the god of the tree, or the god of the wheat, or the god of the sun, or the god of the rain. All of the powers of nature, or the primary powers of nature, were thought to be divine. Okay, that's a kind of animism. Now, what the Judeo-Christian tradition, and let's go back and call it the Israelite tradition, the ancient Israelites, where if you look at the Bible, many of the other nations, the Canaanite nations, the neighbors of ancient Israel, they worshiped many gods. And most of those gods were somehow associated with some element in the natural world. Some element. Usually the major god was the sun, and the reason for that was because the sun was the major power of life in the world. And after the sun came the moon and then the stars, the moon and the stars. Those were usually the major gods. Right? Now, what Israel did, Israel being monotheistic, took all of the characteristics, the powerful characteristics of the gods of the ancient world, and said, that's not a god of life. Life is a characteristic of the God of Israel. The power in the trees is a characteristic of the God of Israel, our God. The power of the sun is a characteristic of our God, and took all of these strengths and not miraculous, but mysterious powers and predicated them to the God of Israel. So what monotheism did was simply narrow down how many gods were represented, but one God was represented in all of these other powers. Which means that becoming monotheistic, and the monotheistic religion of Israel desacralized the powers in the ancient, in the natural world, desacralized them. Now, I'm all for the desacralizing, being a monotheist as we all are. I look at the trees and I might be in awe of the trees, particularly in the springtime. Well, not just in the springtime, fruit bearing trees, bringing forth fruit. But so, I mean, I'm fascinated by, as we all are somehow or other, if not fascinated, certainly interested, because it's something to eat. If not eat, at least sell. So there's some kind of an attraction. So we're interested in these powers, right? So in a certain sense, I don't see them as divine. I see them as manifestations of one deity. So to desacralize, I agree with. However, to minimize and to ignore, and to look at those powers and overlook the powers, I think we have lost an awful lot. So it's not divine power, but there still is an awesomeness in the powers of the natural world. I mean, otherwise, why do people stand and watch a volcano, even though they may be in its path? Or we're fascinated. I used to live on the 23rd floor of an apartment building south of the Loop in Chicago. And I could watch a storm cross the main city. It was fascinating. You'd see it come from the west, and you'd see the lightnings and the clouds, and it would just pass over the city and go onto the lake. And I'd stand and I'd watch it. And sometimes I'd stand outside and watch it underneath, of course, a roof. I would have an open door. And yet sometimes it is still fun to stand out in the rain. Or if you don't like to stand out in the rain, some people still like to walk in the snow. Why is that? That's that mysterious power that attracts us. But we do not think that there is a God of the snow that makes it happen. We think that our God makes it happen. But when we begin to totally dismiss the importance of the natural world, which we have no problem cutting down trees so that we can build a mansion. And then we wonder why, if it floods, we are swamped with mud, because there's no tree with roots that hold the ground down. Because what is important is not the tree, it's whether or not the tree can serve my purposes. Now, that's what Lynn White was talking about. He said the Judeo-Christian tradition did that. First of all, it happened. Certainly, we have desacralized, but we have also dismissed the mystery in the natural world. Unless we're poets, or romantic lovers, or children, or like the Little Prince of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, was fascinated watching the sunset. So fascinated, he moves his chair so he can watch another one and another one. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should read the book. It's not for children. The Little Prince. What is important is not what you see with the eye, it's what you see with the heart. Little children might like the story, but that's for big children. All right, now, going back to Lynn White. So he says, we either have to get a new religion or a new interpretation of the old religion. And I want to say, we don't need a new religion. What we need is a new interpretation of the old religion. Having said that, I want to read something from the Holy Father's document. This is paragraph 111. Ecological culture cannot be reduced to a series of urgent and partial responses to the immediate problems of pollution, ecological decay, and the depletion of natural resources. In other words, it's not enough to recycle. We have to, but it's not enough. It's not enough to reuse. We have to, but it's not enough. There needs to be, says the Holy Father, there needs to be a distinctive way of looking at things, a new way of thinking. That is precisely what Lynn White says. We need a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding our religious tradition. Now, if he claims that the problem is the Genesis 1 creation narrative, I want to suggest an appropriate way of understanding the Genesis 1 creation narrative. And that is the story where God creates the man in the image of God. All right. In the image and according to the likeness. All right. Then later on, male and female, he created them. But I want us to look at image of God. What is an image of God? You cannot say soul. Because if you say soul, soul is a Greek idea. We're in the Hebrew. There is no Hebrew word for soul. And the Bible does not say soul. It does not say God created the human being out of the dirt of the earth, which means earth, body, and soul. It is out of earth and the breath of life, which is not the same as soul. We got to learn how to read what is in the text. Brother Lane would know I used to hammer that all the time. Show me where that's in the text. Okay? We read everything we know into the text. We know a little bit about soul, it must be there. No, read the Hebrew from Hebrew, and then we'll decide, then we'll reinterpret it. So I ask the question again, what is an image of God? There have been all kinds of books written about it. As I said, the primary understanding, which is a valid interpretation, but not a biblical interpretation, is it's the soul. It's valid because later on in history, somebody else interpreted it that way. It's valid, but not biblical. There's a Protestant theologian who said, image of God is the fact that human beings are stand upright. And I'm thinking, and where is that in the text? That's not in the text, so it's not in the original story. So what's an image of God? That we are created. Well, that's not in the story. It just says an image of God. What is an image of God? And I want to answer that very simply. It's precisely what it means. It is an image of God. It is precisely what Israel was forbidden to create. God said, you shall not have graven images. An image of a God was usually a symbol that captured some aspect of the God. Frequently, and it depends upon the nation, the Canaanites, the people who lived in the land before and while Israel was there, the Canaanites, one of their major gods was a god named Baal, and the image of that god was a calf. Remember the story of the golden calf? They made an image. Calf represented God. It was a symbol of God. Why? Why not a turtle dove or an elephant? Because the calf, well, first of all, calf was a virile male image. And they thought that their God was male and virile. And it was young, because that's the peak of virility. Seldom would anybody say that the pig was an image of their God. So pig is a very smart animal. Maybe nowadays they would have made the image of their God a pig. Think about all of the sacred images. Many of them were symbols of some characteristic of their God. So I want to say that the image of God is precisely that, an image of God. But we don't know what the symbol was. All right? But an image of God is not a God. That's why Israel was forbidden to create an image of God, because it is so easy to move from seeing it as a representation or a symbol of God to begin worshiping it as a God. Very easy. I think there are some Protestants or maybe evangelicals, I'm not quite sure, but I know some non-Romans who think Roman Catholics worship Mary or worship statues because of the reverence and the devotion that we place. I mean, sometimes there are, depending upon what the cultic practice is, some people in procession on their knees to the statue of Mary. Now, if you're on your knees, that's close to adoration. I'm not suggesting they adore. I'm just saying I can see how people on the outside might misunderstand some elements of our devotion. Right? So it's very easy to move from looking at and worship, not worshiping, but venerating an image and fall into worshiping it. We in our generation do not do that with images, not concrete images. We normally do that with doctrinal statements. Doctrinal statements. You don't change a doctrinal statement. It is almost taboo to change a doctrinal statement. And so frequently they resist reinterpretation of a doctrinal statement. Right? All I'm saying is it's very natural for us to do that. So the issue is we are created in the image of God. We are not gods. Now, why would I want to make that distinction so emphatically? And the answer is because when you go into Genesis 3, the third chapter, so we move from the first chapter to the third chapter. The third chapter is the story of the sin in the garden. So what was the sin? One would say disobedience, that's true, but in a certain sense, all sin is some form of disobedience. So what was their disobedience? They were told, you can eat of all of the fruits of the trees in the garden, but you cannot eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, art has frequently, the fruit is an apple. Well, but that's not what the text says. The fruit of the tree is the knowledge of good and evil. How do you represent that? And some would say, well, it couldn't have been an apple anyway. They wouldn't have had apples. They would have had pomegranates. It's still not the fruit. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor, right? So the sin is a metaphor. I mean, the way they talk about the knowledge of good and evil, I'm sorry, the sin is not a metaphor. The sin is the reality. What was their sin? What did the serpent tempt the woman with? What did the woman tempt the man with? And what were they condemned for? That they wanted to be God. Read the text carefully. The serpent says to the woman when she said, the Lord God said we can eat of none of the fruit. No, the serpent says, God says you can eat of none of the fruit. And the woman said, no, we can eat of all of the fruit except the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because if we do, we will die. And the serpent says to her, you won't die. You want to become like God. The God does not want you to become like God. All right? And who is not guilty of that sin? That's the great hubris. We are not satisfied being creatures of God. We want to be gods, or we sure want to be treated like that. There's an expression that I grew up with, and I'm sure many of you did as well, or at least you've heard it. Who died and left you boss? I mean, there is the desire, that's not a male characteristic. That's a human characteristic found in men as well as women. I've lived in religious community of women long enough to know we've got it too. Men have no priority over that desire to be in control and desire to lord it over. That's a human characteristic. So that's the great sin. We don't want to be told what to do. We want to be, and it's always a very thin line between normal and appropriate independence and, not allowing anyone else to get even near to our power and authority. So now what do we have in Genesis 1? Does Genesis 1 really say that we are created in the image of God and God gave us the natural world to do with what we wanted? No, it doesn't say that. It says we are created in the image of God. Whatever that means, it's a symbol. It's a metaphor. We'll talk a little bit about it in a moment. It's a metaphor. But we are creatures of God, and we are told to subdue and have dominion as creatures of God or images of God, not as autonomous beings. We are not in control of this world. God is. We learn more and more and more about it, but in no way are we in control. In no way. And the issue, of course, the more we know about science, the more we are tempted to think, give us enough time and money, and we'll be able to conquer the mystery of the universe. That's hubris, the great sin of pride. Only God conquers the mystery of the universe. I doubt whether human, but we learn more and more and more and more. We learn about it. Can we control it? Can we control gravity? I find cosmology fascinating, positively fascinating. It's interesting because I never liked the Star Trek movies, but I find cosmology just fascinating when you think of the vastness of it. When you think we can't even talk about a universe, we talk about multiverse. And not even multiverse, but multiverses. There are probably millions of universes. Millions of universes like ours. I mean, think of the vastness. You can't even possibly comprehend that. So how can we think we're going to have control? But that's the great sin. The great sin is we're not willing to be imaged. Now, what does image mean? Well, again, I want to suggest one way that we can understand, what that biblical text means both the idea of image and subdue and have dominion, but mostly image, is to use another metaphor, and that is the national flag of a country. Our stars and stripes, but the national flag of any country. I think image of God functions in a way very similar to the way a national flag functions. And how does a national flag function? What does it do? It is not simply something pretty. But if you look at the flag itself, it tells you something about the nation. Our flag gives us a history lesson. They've got the stars and we have the stripes. And if we ever have another state, we add another stripe. We'll always have the same number of stars, but we add another stripe. Or you look at other national flags, they have a symbol that represents their nation. Everybody knows Ireland from the shamrock, or Japanese of the rising sun. So the flag, in a certain sense, tells you something about the people of that nation. And how does the flag function? It tells you where that nation has jurisdiction, where that nation functions. Every once in a while, you drive around Chicago and you see a house that's got an Irish flag. Which that does not mean that house belongs to the nation of Ireland. But of course, what you've got in there is people of Irish ancestry, or maybe even citizens of Ireland. But that flag has no power in this country. When it's used like that, it does not exercise any power. Think of what happened in our capital on January 6th. Think of the outrage of so many people, the way our flag was used. One might think, when you really come down to it, so what? And the answer is because of what that flag represents. That flag represents the jurisdiction and support of our nation, support of what is going on. That's what that flag said. And that's why so many people were outraged by it. And that's also why other people use the flag to say that. Wherever our flag or any national flag waves, the nation that flag represents. The flag is a symbol, but a symbol with tremendous power. Tremendous power. But it is a symbol of the power and jurisdiction of the nation. Image of God is a symbol of tremendous power, of functioning in the world, subdue and have dominion. It says, increase, multiply, fill the earth. That's where we subdue and have dominion. But how? As a representative, as a symbol representing the power and jurisdiction of God, not of the flag, not of the image. So anytime, and sometimes, I have read, and I probably, learned, that human beings were created by God and given the natural world. There's no place in the text where it says, here, you can have it. But there is a place in the text that says, I'm putting you on earth, and I want you on earth to represent me. Now, maybe those exact words are not there. The exact words are made in the image of God, subdue and have dominion. That's what it means. Now, you take that understanding of image of God and use it as an examination of conscience, both individually, communally, politically, and religiously. Think of where you are in the world, in this nation, as I must with myself as well, and ask the question, where I am, do people look at me and see the power of God? Do they see God functioning in the world? We call that today witness. Do people look at me and see that I am living out my Christian commitment? Am I a witness to the goodness of God in the world? Or do they look at me and see, or you, and see somebody trying to climb to the top, trying to, reputation. Reputation is so significant in the world. I want to tell you, particularly it certainly is in the academic world. I mean, think of where you live and work. I mean, people that are climbing whatever rung it is. They want to be first. I mean, that's the desire for us, to be in charge, to control. It's a very natural thing. And again, it's very difficult to hold appropriate desire for advancement and this desire to control, to hold it in balance, to even recognize which one it is. It's very difficult. At least that's been my experience in life, and I'm not that different. I'm not that different. I mean, every once in a while, if I'm lucky, while I'm in a situation where I have a chance to step on somebody's neck, I tell myself, what's the point, Diane? You don't want to act like that. You don't want to be like that. All right. So we all go through that. That's all part of maturing. We all get older. We don't all grow up. We just get older. It's a part of growing up into Christ, to grow into Christ. So that's what image of God means. Now, that means when we look at image of God that way, it in no way does it say human beings are not significant. We are, but we're not God. We, in a certain sense, we function in this world, or we should function in this world the way God would function. We represent the dignity and the graciousness of God. So with that kind of understanding of the text, and I want to say it really is a closer reading of the text. With that kind of an understanding of the text, you cannot say that story in the Bible gives human beings the right to take what they want from earth and give nothing back. To strip the land, to violate the laws of nature for our benefit or for our convenience. I was listening today to the news, the weather report, and they were talking about, having good weather. And I'm always fascinated by that expression. Just what is good weather? Have you ever thought about that? What's good weather? And I want to suggest what we mean when we talk about good weather is weather that does not inconvenience us. Bad weather inconveniences us. When there's too much rain, we're inconvenienced. Because there's nothing about the fact that we need rain. Oh no, we're inconvenienced. How often waiting for a bus during a storm, people get angry. Waiting for a bus during a storm. They are angry at the storm. And of course, then they take it out on the bus driver. What do we think? I've got a schedule. And therefore, now just a minute, no more rain until I get my bus because I've got a schedule. But that's the way I draw it out in a ridiculous way. But that's the kind of thinking we do. When there's terrible, I happen to have been in India, up in the north, when the tsunami, when was that? Oh, about 20 years ago, when the tsunami hit the south. And thousands of people were killed, thousands. And people say, why were all those people killed? But they're not asking, a geological question. They're asking a religious question. Why did God allow that to happen? But the question is, why were they killed? And the answer is very simple and very cold. They were killed because they were there. What was God to do? What we think Charlton Heston did in the movie, The 10 Commandments, he put his hand out and the water stopped. The waters stood up. Is that what we really expect? I make it ridiculous, but you know what I mean, because we all are involved in that. We sort of think that our agenda should really be the agenda of the natural world, and it should adjust to us. It should not rain on our parade. Now, I've got nothing against praying that we have good weather for the parish picnic. But what are you really praying for? Are you really praying that the clouds do not come together? I mean, are you praying that God will fool around with the clouds? I think what we're praying is we are acknowledging we're not in charge. That's what we're doing when we pray for good weather. Because if we were in charge, we wouldn't have to ask God to take care of it. We take care of it ourselves. We're acknowledging our limitations, which is good prayer, always good prayer. At any rate, I want to make a point of this because one of the words that the Holy Father uses, and this will be the last thing, and then maybe we can break up into discussion questions. But one of the words that the Holy Father uses in this document frequently is the word anthropocentric. Anthropocentric comes from two Greek words, anthropos, which means human, and centric, which of course is centered. So anthropocentric means human-centered. That means it's anthropocentric is very much like egocentric, but egocentric is individual. Anthropocentric is really, the whole community is like that, thinking that the center of everything is the human being. It's not. And I hope, that I haven't burst your bubble here. We are not the center. The only thing we're the center of is our own ego. And I don't know about you, unfortunately, I'm not even the center of the group of which I'm a part or the groups of which I'm a part. Unless, of course, I'm teaching because then they're listening to me. But then I never am sure that they're listening to me anyway. I don't always know what's going on when I stand in front of people who have a computer open. Are they listening or are they email? You never really know. Right? And again, I speak lightly about that. But, most of us are not the center of anything. There are moments when we are. But there is that mentality that we are the center of everything. Everything evolves around human beings. Everything has value if it has value for me, for us. And if it has no value for us, it has no value, throw it away, it's garbage. And we know that everything that's thrown away is not garbage because people who are desperate go to see what they can scrounge, and they make a pretty good living sometimes, not just from food, but from other things. So he uses that word all the time. But whenever he uses it, he always uses it with a negative adjective. Radical anthropocentrism, distorted anthropocentrism, sinful anthropocentrism, misdirected anthropocentrism. And why? Because first of all, we are always going to be anthropocentric. Contrary to what some movies would say, the horse whisperer does not know what the horse is thinking. We really do not understand the world the way other animals understand it. The only way we understand the world and value the world is from a human perspective. And as wonderful as the human perspective is, it's limited. It's limited. And the limited point of view can never be in charge, whether that limitation is individual, mine, ours as Roman Catholics, ours as United States citizens. That's part of, the arrogance of the United States. There's no way of doing anything except the way the United States does it. That arrogance has been shown. And in no way am I suggesting the other nations are better, but our arrogance, that we have to always be number one. We're not even willing to share first place. We got to always be number one. Well, it has exploded in our face in many ways. Well, like everybody else, we get sick from the virus like everybody else. We die like everybody else. We're no better. We're no better. Now watch who's going to take a pride of accomplishment in the vaccines, which are not produced. Where's Pfizer produced? I think in Germany. I'm not quite sure. but I mean, some of the places of production of these vaccines you can't even read, which means there are all over the world, there are people working on some kind of a vaccine, all over the world. So we're foolish if we think in the world in which we live today, we can think the only way of understanding is to understand the American way. That's a very narrow, it's a valid point of view, but it's not the only one. So anthropocentrism means human point of view is a valid point of view, but it's limited. At the heart of all ecological devastation is radical anthropocentrism, thinking it's ours to do with what we want. It is ours to do with what we want. And if we can't use it, it has no value. It has no value. So he speaks against that constantly. Constantly. All right. This particular passage is frequently used, I think, inappropriately to give credence to the idea of radical anthropocentrism. You can't use it if you read it appropriately. And it's just one little passage. Okay, that's the beginning of looking at Laudato Si. And I start there because you really cannot, I don't think we can really appreciate how do we get a handle on what we can do, you know, for not just our climate, but for the natural world in which we live. We may get the point where there's the point of no return. Some ecologists tell us, or some professionals tell us in some ways, we don't want to pass that, where there's a point of no return. If all of the glaciers melt, we're going to have tremendous flooding. And, you know, maybe it will be the great flood of the 21st century, which wiped out all of life. Wouldn't that be terrible? And I'm no prognostic. I'm not prognostic. I can't say the word. It's Sunday evening. I am not looking into the future, you know, and looking and seeing the future. But I'm just saying, I'm repeating some of the concerns that other people have. All right, that's the issue that we want to look at. Now what is it? Let me focus it with a couple of questions that you will be broken up into small groups to maybe discuss. Number one, the first question is, how does, and I'm going to use the word radical anthropocentrism now that I have explained it. How does radical anthropocentrism, or to understand it another way, an appropriate understanding of human privilege, how does radical anthropocentrism show itself in our world in today? That's one question.
You gotta unmute first.
I did.
No, it's, oh, okay.
Oh, okay, I thought, all right.
We're back. Thank you. I'm just going to hit the button to get us into the breakout rooms.
Okay.
Go over here, maybe do 5.
We're going to do 5 breakout rooms, I think.
Let me give the second question.
Okay.
Okay. And the second question is how do you understand your relationship with the rest of the natural world? I didn't talk a lot about that, but I think you should think about that and maybe discuss that. So the first thing has to do with how does radical anthropocentrism manifest itself? So that would be, in a certain sense, looking at the negative. And the other one looks inside one's own self. How do you understand your relationship with the rest of the natural world?
Okay. We're going to break into groups for 10 minutes.